Okay, so we're going to start. So, nice to see you all. Welcome to tonight's lecture, organised by the Manton Centre for British Art. I'm Steve Edwards, Director of the Centre, which presents an extensive programme of events on art in Britain and its extended colonial networks. We're extremely grateful to the Manton Foundation for their generous support for the Courtauld, the Centre and its events programme. Tonight's lecture is presented by Altair Brandon-Salmon. Altair is an art historian and lecturer in civic, liberal and global education at Stanford University. I wish I had a title like that. His scholarship on modern art has appeared in Art History, Art Journal, British Art Studies. I know it's appeared in the Oxford Art Journal because I edited it. And he's also been curator for the Sheldonian Theatre and Campion Hall at the University of Oxford. He's currently a guest curator for Projects 22, and his book, Rubble, Art, the Blitz, and London in Ruins is forthcoming in spring next year. Altair's title tonight, as you can see, a fascinating title, and as such a lecturer I'm very much looking forward to, Electric Contrasts, Kenneth Clark and Vision in 19th Century Britain. Altair will speak for about 55 minutes, after which we'll take questions, and then we'll move next door for drinks, and if you wish, the conversation can continue. So glad to see you all here, and thank you, Altair. Over to you.
Thank you, Steve, and thank you for the whole team here at Courtauld for hosting me. It's an enormous pleasure to be here. A small child in elaborate costume peers around a stone balcony, eyes focused on the scene lying across the page. The view through a window of a walled Dutch town with gabled houses and an elaborate church nestled in the crook of low hills. The child is from Carlo Crivelli's The Annunciation, and the window is in The Virgin and Child before a fire screen by a follower of Robert Campin, both in the National Gallery in London. The dialogue between painting defeats history and geography, made possible only by cropping the paintings into slivers, two black and white photographs laid out in Kenneth Clark's 1938 book, 100 Details from Pictures in the National Gallery. This was a radically new way of seeing, featuring pairs of details that serve to provoke, amuse, and demonstrate art historical claims made by Clark, at the time director of the National Gallery. The succession of photographs reveals a distinctive kind of vision in Britain during the 1930s, a result of art history's emergence as a discipline and its collision with the latest technology and media, electric lighting, photography, film, television and radio. The book's popular success reveals a distinctive modernist eye which recasts the National Gallery's collection of Western art as a series of revelatory flashes. The telling detail becomes central to an art history composed of pictures. It was a project only possible, conceptually and technically, when what it meant to look at art was being transformed in Britain. A book of details of primarily Renaissance and Baroque art from Italy and the Netherlands becomes a distillation of German-inflected art historical theory of the late 19th and early 20th centuries, twisted by Clark through its encounter with photography. The vision that results is focused on the close-up, a form of editing which intensifies the experience of modernity itself. The avant-garde Soviet filmmaker Sergei Eisenstein was the first to recognize the profound implications of 100 Details. He saw that, quote, these details are grouped here completely independently of the paintings to which they belong, and only for their own charm and innovative character. The detail takes on its own agency, divorced from the painting's larger context. Clark, as curator and editor, takes control of their meanings. Eisenstein, one of the leading theorists of montage in Soviet cinema, argues that, quote, the passion for detail as a phenomenon of an autonomous activity only reaches its true fulfillment today. This type of sight has an explicitly political dimension to it. Eisenstein continues, a particular state of mind must therefore be formed in the man of the bourgeois century. The detail is then no longer interesting in its relationship to the whole, like the manifestation of its reflection. It is considered as a thing in itself, isolated and individualized, separated and diverted. His union with the whole is outside him. Exactly like the inspiration for this phase of decadence, an asocial individualist interested only in a part of society, in a few isolated details, excluding himself from the common cause, from common interests, from life or community. For Eisenstein, 100 Details acts as a parallel to Britain's economic and social relations, defined by the individual rather than the collective. This critique signals the book's modernity and its power. Canonical art becomes the embodiment of a new era, new form of sight, where the detail is valorized as more powerful than that which it is excerpted from. How did 100 Details help shape a modernity which saw old master painting as a form of contemporary art? What ideas and techniques were needed for this book to not only be legible, but strike a chord with audiences? The book reflected recent developments in art history while changing the dynamic between text and illustration. Clark emerges as a crucial interlocutor between the German School of Art History and the large and increasing public for art in interwar London. To pin down all these questions, I will first illuminate the National Gallery in the 1930s itself at a crucial moment of institutional transformation, which led to the production of 100 Details and a series of photo books which placed the detail as central to their enterprise. This will lead us into the role of photography in art history's development through the work of Heinrich Wölfflin, Aby Warburg, and Walter Benjamin. The detail here is an art historical methodology which will come into focus, crucial to the connoisseurship of Giovanni Morelli, Bernard Berenson, and Yukio Yashiro. Finally, 100 Details will emerge as a cinematic text where Eisenstein's writing provides a basis for seeing the book as helping to define an interwar modernist side characterized by contrast and juxtaposition. Throughout all this will be Kenneth Clark himself, a figure who, through his immense social web, was connected to nearly all of those art historians and was able to absorb their ideas and create something new. Modernism in 1930s Britain is not a straightforward story of the avant-garde in ascent. It did not dismantle class distinctions or act as a politically revolutionary force in society. Indeed, modernism often emanated from the bohemian aristocratic environs of Bloomsbury, Oxford, and the Café Royal. T.J. Clark has observed that modernism must be a, quote, balance of distance and literalness, which is modernism's way of keeping the half-truths of the parent culture at bay. It comes out of a habitus, a sustained marginality, keeping alive a fragile way of life. For T.J. Clark, this marginality is absent from 20th century British art. So modernism here needs to be understood as carrying a distinctive accent, perhaps the patrician accent of Kenneth Clark himself, which, as James Stevenson has argued, should be termed as modern Baroque, defined by the frivolous, prodigal, feminine, queer, decorative, and equivocal. This was the terrain that Clark, as director of the National Gallery and in his writing, enjoyed traversing, refusing to commit fully to either a formalist or positive approach to painting. He was also intensely conscious of the National Gallery's role as an institution for the widest of audiences. This is why emphasizing the commercial dimension of 100 Details seems to best capture its effect. The book shall be placed alongside neon lights, the cinema, and the automobile as an expression of its era. 100 Details appeared when, as Martin Hammer's noted, artists and critics were partisans for abstraction, socialist realism, surrealism, and neo-romanticism in attempting to represent modern Britain. Clark, who subsequently would be portrayed as a young bogey and an establishment mandarin, sidestepped those debates with 100 Details by creating a modernist lens through which to view works by the old masters. His ambition was to change no less how the public saw art, so that it was made anew once again. Pictures look back at us as we look at them. In one pairing in 100 Details, Angers, Madame Mosselier, and Peter Paul Rubens, Susanna London, gaze out at the reader, their eyes a mixture of curiosity and evaluation of their audience. Clark knew that paintings could be an exchange of gazes, a form of conversation with looking as its medium. This direct confrontation with the reader was a crucial maneuver performed within the book, so that the sitters in the work, seen in close-up, their period backgrounds omitted, enter into the reader's present. Their dialogue is no longer taking place in the past, but in the present. Yet to participate in this conversation, one needed to see the paintings. Light came to the National Gallery on 6th of March 1935. Electric lighting was finally installed, transforming how people could see the collection. This resulted in a new glare to the surface of the artworks, the Times reported, but details emerged from the shadows. Clark, who would become director in 1934, emphasized the transformation by lighting up the gallery's portico for the occasion. Previously, the gallery had relied on natural light, not even utilizing gaslight or arc lights, causing the paintings being hard to see during the winter or on frequent rainy days. Clark's modernization of the gallery changed how the art could be seen. Equally, he wanted to shift who saw the paintings. Electric lighting allowed the gallery to stay open until 8 o'clock in the evening during the week, which the Times noted would create a new class of visitors, allowing people in offices to be able to step inside after work. In another populist initiative, Clark had opened the gallery at 7 o'clock in the morning on the day of the FA Cup final in 1934, while he hired a public relations firm and advertised the evening openings on London Underground posters. Clark's strategy was a success, with over 100,000 more people coming to the gallery in the first 5 years of his tenure. They saw a different gallery too. Clark hanged the paintings according to schools, reducing the numbers of pictures on the walls so that individual works could be seen more clearly. His tenure as director was marked by his embrace of technology. He used the profits of sales of postcards in the gallery's shop to fund a new scientific department, which could X-ray paintings to reveal ghostly sketches beneath the pigment. He also realized that the photographic department established in 1919 could be utilized to a far greater extent. Initially, he had the photographic department make images of details of paintings for conservation purposes, but later he confessed, quote, "actually because they gave me pleasure." The department was staffed by women, including A.M. Ricard, a Mrs. Wilson, and a Mrs. Tierney. It was the high-quality black and white photographs made by Ricard and her team which would form 100 Details. 100 Details from Pictures in the National Gallery was published in the winter of 1938, just after the Munich crisis, which had seen 50 paintings moved out of the gallery to Penrhyn Castle in Bangor in case of war. The book cost a bewilderingly small 6 shillings, Clark aiming for it to have mass appeal. Appearing on the precipice of war, it was widely reviewed in the Illustrated London News, The Listener, New Statesman, and the Sunday Times. Clark, always canny at garnering publicity, dispatched copies far and wide as a Christmas present, from Winston Churchill to Neville Chamberlain, Maurice Barra and Edith Sackville-West, Dennis Mahon and Graham Sutherland, along with various ambassadors and aristocrats. The National Gallery had long published catalogues and illustrated guides for the public, with former directors Frederick Burton and Charles Holmes especially attuned to writing for mass audiences. Clark, though, working with O.M. Cook, the supervisor of publications, saw the department could present the collection in different ways, outside of guidebooks or exhibition catalogues. In 1937 came the hardback 100 masterpieces from the National Gallery, which had no commentary, just black and white photographs. And in 1939, the smaller soft-cover portraiture, featuring 24 black and white plates of portraits in the gallery. Clark, in the introduction to portraiture, wrote that the genre flourishes in periods of growing individualism and saw the works as demonstrating the artist's personality and the character of the sitter. It's a slim little book, small enough to fit in a pocket, not at all like the large format 100 Details, which represented a more creative and provocative presentation of the collection. The genesis of 100 Details lay in Clark's childhood. He remembered being given a guide to the Louvre in 1910 when he was aged 7, which featured 50 colour plates, enough to give me some notion of classic European painting. This book was my most treasured possession for a couple of years. Clark was amongst the first generation to see canonical Western art first through photographs and photographs, rather than in museums or through engravings. In that sense, he was a child of the 20th century. So 100 Details would aim to redefine old master paintings through a new lens, hoping to have as large an impact on audiences as the images from the Louvre had had on him. He summed up his program of action for 100 Details in a letter to his former mentor and the art historian Bernard Berenson in October 1938. Quote, "The comparison of the plates in each opening makes some point of interest, historical, aesthetic, or anecdotal. To each I have given a short note of explanation. I think it will be a nice-looking book, and the notes will at least show the number of different ways in which a civilized person can look at pictures. The image pairings will be bereft of all apparatus. The beginning of the book held an introduction and then his urbane conversational captions, identifying the details and offering a particular tangent for thought and analysis. The lack of supporting information with the plates themselves encouraged the readers to aestheticize the details before turning back to identify them, or to read Clark's thoughts. The images came first. Clark was a curator of sight, directing the readers to see these paintings from a new angle, influenced by the nascent technology of television. The BBC had begun broadcasting a television service in November 1936 from Alexandra Palace in North London to 5,000 households which had television sets in the southeast of England. Clark visited the studios to investigate whether they would be suitable for filming paintings, although the intense heat of the lighting and the low quality of the transmission argued against it for the time being. Still, he participated in 2 BBC television programmes, first in December 1937 for Artists and Their Work, where he gave a lecture on Florentine painting, and then again in February 1939 as the host of Sight and Sound, where a panel of 4 artists were asked to identify the author of lines of poetry, and 4 poets had to identify who had painted particular details from works of art. 100 Details is strongly rooted in this emergence of television, with a pair of images, a form of editing on Clark's part. Sight and Sound had been a game show, and he described 100 Details as an amusing game, too. Readers could try their hand at attributing a work to Botticelli or Rubens, or guess which painting the detail was taken from. Clark's grasp on television's potential would come to fruition in the post-war era, climaxing with the phenomenon of Civilization, A Personal View in 1969. The other new technology which informed 100 Details was radio. Clark's captions, isolated from the images, have the style of a radio talk. This was a medium which Clark would thrive in, especially during the Second World War, where he delivered a large number of talks on arts and culture. In the book's introduction, Clark wrote that his dueling notes represent the kind of conversation which two people fond of painting might have while going around the National Gallery. One good result of this informal method is that every note shows a different approach, for nothing is more fatal to criticism than the fallacy of one cause. He was keen to avoid any apparent dogmatism, while equally persuaded of the facility of his own aesthetic judgments, and enjoyed deploying them for shock. Early Rembrandts are, on the whole, the ugliest pictures ever produced by a supremely great artist. The reader might be persuaded or resist Clark's deceptive elegance. The distance between the captions and the pictures, requiring one to flick back and forth, means that the reader is able, unlike on television, to sidestep the compression of narrative and image. Clark's notes were a conversation, just as the pictures themselves perform a dialogue across the pages. It allowed him to stage his erudition, his affability, his penchant for attributions, and critical analysis. The book allowed him to faithfully to record, in front of concrete examples, whatever impressions the moment admits. He was no partisan of one approach, except for the broader allegiance to European art of the 15th to the 17th centuries. The informality of the double conversations, of Clark's notes and the pictures themselves, means that these canonical paintings are freed from being representatives of an epoch or ossified as masterpieces which embody the past. Instead, the paintings are transformed by photography into emblems of the 1930s. By attempting to restore Renaissance and Baroque art as cultural experiences available to the present, Clark was harking all the way back to the connoisseurship of Giovanni Morelli, who thought that conversation in a gallery, quote, restores the original scene of the discourse of art. Talk, as Christopher Wood has explained, is plastic, interactive, the medium of free convergence of subjects unsustained by external authorities. This is the tone Clark aimed for in his notes, while hoping that the images themselves would stimulate readers' own conversations. It's a book to leaf through, asking questions. Who painted this? From what picture has this been taken? The images talk to one another, and we talk to them and amongst ourselves, with Clark as the narrator and curator. Clark would later emphasize that I wrote in an informal and quasi-conversational style, which I now see as the kind of immediacy that I was later to attempt on television. I recognized for the first time the sound of my own voice. 100 details emerged from the crucible of photography, television, and radio, just at the moment when they were crystallizing into the media of modernity. Yet technology alone was not enough. To present details from paintings as an aesthetic experience and as an argument reached back in time towards the very formation of art history as a discipline itself. One of the most beautiful pairings is of a man, a boy hovering on the edge of manhood, asleep, his long curling hair falling on a seashell while wasps buzz around his head. Its companion image is of two masks, hollow-eyed, lying in some indeterminate space. Yet the mask closest to us has eyebrows and a thick nose with a goatee beard of wispy white hair. It is a face and a mask at the same time. Beauty, it is suggested, can be its own kind of deception. The man's immaculate skin more illusionary than the creased and lined surface of the mask on the opposing page. The man is from Botticelli's Venus and Mars, and the masks are from the corner of Bronzino's An Allegory with Venus and Cupid. Clark's captions point to two countervailing trends in how he approached his pairs. The Botticelli painting illustrated the artist's approach to drawing, Clark argued, the work leaning towards expressiveness rather than accuracy, in contradistinction to Mantegna or Dürer. While Bronzino's masks showed the grotesque, the unreal, the gargoyle element in art that could be introduced with propriety in Renaissance art. On the one hand, Clark is concerned with questions of form, and on the other of iconology, the relationship of sources, often literary, to the subjects of artworks. This puts into practice his aspiration for the book as a conversation about art history, the different approaches one can take to looking at or envisioning a painting, drawing on a series of scholars who had often personally encountered. Clark explained the logic of his contrasting pairs in his introduction. Quote, "They have been chosen chiefly for their beauty, and since two details must face one another when the book is opened, they have been arranged in such a way as to bring out certain analogies and contrasts. Some of these contrasts are like epigrammatic summaries of the history of art, in particular those which show the differences between northern and Mediterranean painting. But the majority of openings have been arranged because the details have something in common, either of movement and design or of subject and mood." The medium afforded Clark the ability to outline a dialectical art history, divided and unified by time, geography, and form. Two things need to be established here: art history's relationship to the contrasting pair of artworks and the use of the detail, a heavily cropped photograph of a part of an artwork, to make an argument. The contrast of two artworks dates back almost to the beginning of art history as an academic discipline. Hermann Grimm, professor of art history at Friedrich Wilhelm Universität in Berlin from 1873 to 1901, used photographic slides extensively, putting together a collection of 15,000 slides during his tenure. He wanted an art history told through images. The comparison of two works of art via slide projection was already a standard mode of instruction by the time Heinrich Wölfflin succeeded Grimm in Berlin. Indeed, it could be persuasively argued that art history in universities would not have developed without the use of photography. Heinrich Wölfflin's own landmark book, Principles of Art History, The Problem of the Development of Style in Later Art from 1915, is oriented precisely around these pairings. He argues that different visual cultures, primarily the Renaissance and the Baroque, could be understood for a series of 5 formal oppositions: linear versus painterly, plane and recession, closed and open form, multiplicity and unity, and finally, clearness and unclearness. This argument is buttressed by reproductions of artworks which are frequently cropped to highlight a particular dynamic. The opening juxtaposition of Botticelli's Birth of Venus and Lorenzo di Credi's Venus strips away the Botticelli to focus on the figure of Venus of herself and intensify the comparison to di Credi, which for Wölfflin underlines Botticelli's animation of the human body in comparison to di Credi's conception of the body as a static object. Without the use of reproductions, art history would have been limited to art academies and museums. With slide projection and photographs, the field of objects that could be described, compared, and analyzed was dramatically expanded, no longer constrained by geography or memory or unreliable prints. Clark was familiar with Wölfflin's work and lectured, aged 27, on Principles of Art History at the University of London in 1930, where he demonstrated Wölfflin's series of antitheses with dual slide projection. Clark was participating in the German tradition of art history defined by bifocal vision, where an argument ought to unfold not just verbally, but through image pairings. For Wölfflin, the oral account of the artwork in a lecture should blend seamlessly with the visual comparison projected onto the screen in a darkened auditorium. A spectacle that seems irresistibly cinematic and anticipate television's own treatment of art in the post-war era with its vivid narration and carefully chosen imagery. It is no surprise that Clark was influenced by German art history's formalist approach and its methodology, so that the very process of looking at art becomes a critical question, shaped by technology. Clark had been in Berlin in 1922 and then to Dresden in 1926 during the high point of German language art history. Clark wrote that almost all writers on philosophy and the history of art who had influenced me most deeply, Hegel, Schopenhauer, Jacob Burckhardt, Wölfflin, Altair Brandon-Salmon, Max Vorach, had been German or German trained. These 19th and 20th century philosophers and art historians represented a distinct way of engaging with questions of form and history, which were far more rigorous than the more essayistic mode of Walter Pater, John Ruskin, and other English language writers on art that Clark had grown up with. The photographic reproduction was established in Clark's mind as an essential component of the practice of art history. Walter Benjamin had argued in 1936 that the mechanical reproduction of art undermined the original work's aura. Clark does not seem to have known Benjamin's writing. Instead, he thought photographs, quote, encourage us to look at pictures more attentively and show us some of the rewards of patient scrutiny. They fulfill one of the first functions of criticism by presenting familiar material from a fresh point of view. Here, the photographic detail becomes a critical act on the original artwork, capable of carrying its own meaning. The emotive power of carefully arranged reproductions was emphasized when Clark attended Aby Warburg's lecture at the Bibliothek Hertziana, the German Art Historical Institute in Rome, on 19th of January 1929. Entitled Roman Antiquity and the Workshop of Domenico Ghirlandaio, Clark said the lecture changed his life. He described how in the library of the Hertziana were screens of photographs embodying almost all the subjects which had ever occupied Warburg's mind, and he would dart from one to another, always coming to rest in front of my chair. His whole approach was entirely new to me. Warburg's focus on the transmission of symbols from antiquity into the Renaissance, and even up to the present day, whether it be a gesture or an object or form, stood in stark contrast to the connoisseurship of Clark's mentor, Bernard Berenson. The Florentine painter Ghirlandaio for Warburg was a crucial intermediary in the development of Quattrocento painting, adapting both Northern Renaissance art and classical imagery. He used this starting point as an opportunity to present part of his Bilder Atlas, image atlas, that he had been working on since 1925, an art history composed of images where collage-like reproductions of paintings, engravings, and photographs, cropped and cut, will be placed together to convey his arguments, demonstrating that the pagan antiquity of classical Greece and Rome persisted through motifs and expressions into Renaissance art. The lecture, for over 100 people, lasted for over 2 hours. But it was not the argument that Warburg made which impressed Clark so much as how he conveyed his ideas. Warburg, imitating the Dominican friar Girolamo Savonarola or the Medicean poet Angelo Poliziano in front of his boards, which featured 270 or more black and white images. The panels showed works of architecture, friezes, and parts of paintings. Warburg never published his Bilder Atlas Nemoncine, despite posthumous attempts at the Warburg Institute in London through the 1930s. The Institute had moved from Hamburg to London in December 1933 with its library of 15,000 photographs to flee the Third Reich. Clark called Warburg's writings beautifully edited fragments, and he himself did not turn towards an art history of symbols. The reproductions, though, left their mark. There are echoes of Warburg's focus on Renaissance festivals and pagan symbols in Clark's commentary in 100 Details, noting the fantasy and invention of Filippino Lippi's work, which shows the ephemeral decorations, pageants, and masquerades now completely lost to us from the Quattrocento. More important, though, was the concept which lay at the heart of Warburg's Bilder Atlas, constellations of images meant to be compared, contrasted, and connected, seen by the viewer without accompanying captions. 100 Details would be a more capricious version of Warburg's project. In one image stands a child in front of a dog and 2 leopards pulling a chariot. An errant leg dangles from an unseen figure. In the other image, a bear leaps from a waterfall towards a lion, while St. Jerome kneels in prayer in the background. The details are taken from Titian's Bacchus and Ariadne and Filippino Lippi's The Virgin and Child with Saints Jerome and Dominic. These are amongst the most astonishing details in 100 Details. Eisenstein called them surprising, while Clark pointed to them as examples of how viewers do not truly see all of a picture. They show painting's potent ability to conjure up a world, another world from our own, that can be whimsical or fantastical, the very material which the Surrealists have been utilizing as their own work during the 1930s. By removing the mythological and religious narratives and leaving only the inexplicable details, Clark created images that were more potent, more provocative than what could have been achieved by reproducing the whole painting. The details, which surely were selected from the images made by the photographic department rather than looking at the paintings themselves, become pliable in the curator's hand, not just because Clark is able to crop and arrange them as he likes. The black and white photography itself has a leveling effect. Shorn of colour, the paintings seem far more similar to one another. André Malraux later wrote that the photograph imparts a family likeness to objects that have actually but slight affinity. For Malraux, black and white reproductions create fictitious arts where the fragment is king. It can reveal a submerged detail, a small moment of beauty, independent of scale. The fragmentary image transforms the artwork and opens it up as an infinity of combinations. More importantly for Malraux, the works acquire quite startling if spurious modernism. This is all part of Clark's ambition to make his readers see the gallery's collection as wholly contemporary. The detail becomes an event or an incident, in the words of George Bernard Shaw, who wrote a letter to Clark saying that he found, quote, the pictures which I had supposed were quite familiar to me had acquired fresh interest. I was astonished at the number of details, quite important ones that I had never noticed and in fact never seen. This was part of the point. The details, almost invisible when seen as part of a whole, had now been transformed into distinct black and white works of art. This monochrome vision is related to the long tradition of engravings reproducing oil paintings, which is associated almost with disinterested documentation. There isn't meant to be any artistry in the mere act of reproduction, causing audiences to think that photographs in black and white are considered good because they are so true, not because they are so real. This was especially the case in the 1930s when color plates reproducing oil paintings had inconsistent color tones. This meant that readers approached the images in 100 Details as simultaneously authentic shards from the past and as being in cultural continuity with other black and white media of the day, newspapers, magazines, films. Clark was aware that monochrome reproductions failed to capture the modelling of a subject in colour, leading to the book favouring linear art at the expense of the painterly. This meant that Clark adopted Wölfflin's polarities in some of his pairings, such as between the two Madonnas from the Ansidei Madonna by Raphael and Leonardo's The Virgin of the Rocks, contrasting the linear and the painterly, part of his ambition for 100 Details to embody through images the ideas which underpinned art history. While reproductions of paintings were central to the study of art from the mid-19th century onwards, where did the valorization of the detail emerge from? The representative power of photography meant that the detail was always present in connoisseurship. Clark's own intellectual formation came from his relationship with Bernard Berenson, the American art dealer and critic in Tuscany, who had become famous and wealthy from his list attributing Renaissance works to artists. It was through Berenson that Clark is connected to the ears and fingernails of Giovanni Morelli. Berenson had first met Morelli in Italy in 1889 and subsequently read his works. Morelli argued that one could attribute an artwork on the basis of details which betrayed a specific artist's style, particularly areas of the human body which he claimed were rendered automatically. The shape of a finger or a toe is believed to reveal the secret identity of the artist. Here, history is dispensed from vision, and instead the viewer prioritized, as Clark described, visual memory, not just of specific details, but of spatial and compositional elements, as well as, quote, the almost indescribable way in which a line evokes a form, and for the equally mysterious relationship of tone and color. Morelli exhaustively catalogued the distinctive stylistic attributes of artists like Titian, where the base of the thumb in his men's hands is abnormally developed, or compares the ears of Mantegna and Bellini. Morelli did not just assess paintings, but assembled reproductions. For the purpose of serious and comparative study, photography is an invaluable aid, he wrote, by emphasizing what Edgar Vint would call the unspoiled fragment. Morelli hoped to reanimate the traces of past masters. History and criticism was superfluous. All that was tacitly inherited of the Renaissance was the accurate identification of an artist's corpus. Berenson built on Morelli's attributions while also greedily collecting photographs of paintings and their details, all the better to focus on the distinctive style of the painter. Clark worked as Berenson's research assistant on a new edition of the Drawings of Florentine Painters between 1925 and 1929. Crucial to this endeavor was making photographic details of artworks. Clark wrote to Mary Berenson in 1926 describing his ambition to learn all I can do which will be useful to you. This includes taking photos with a Sanderson half plate, a good Zeiss lens, panchromatic plates, and a little practice. I should be able to take details of any picture in almost any light. Clark later wrote about how photographs were central to Berenson's process of attribution. Bulging cardboard folders of photographs were taken into BB's room, artist by artist, for him to examine. Most of the photographs were very old, and many of them were stained by fungus. Old silver print photographs were on thin painter, and Mrs. Berenson had laboriously stuck them down onto cardboard. By this point, Berenson, ensconced in Villa Itati, made most of his attributions on the basis of reproductions, assiduously gathered by Clark and other assistants, or sent to him by dealers from across Europe. When Clark was back in England, he would send Berenson photographs throughout the 1930s. The great game of attribution, which Clark considered for a time the only game worth playing, was grounded in these photographic details, so that the very splintering of an artwork reduced the hands, feet, noses, and pockets of landscape were thought to embody a material and historical truth. It is through Berenson that Clark met the Japanese art historian Yukio Yashiro in 1927, whose work would be the genesis of 100 Details. Clark was explicit about Yashiro's influence in his introduction. Although the beauty of such details seem obvious to us, they had been taken for scientific purposes for many years before anyone thought of reproducing them for their own sakes, and I believe that it was the Japanese critic Yukio Yashiro who first used them as aids to appreciation in his book on Botticelli. Clark is referring to Yashiro's 1925 monograph, where there is one volume of text and 2 volumes of reproductions, many of which are details. Indeed, Yashiro's images highlighting the figures from Venus and Mars will be explicitly recreated in 100 Details. Even in 1926, Clark had written to Mary Berenson that with a Sanderson half-plate field camera, we shall be able to, quote, Yashiro-ize anything we like. Yashiro's deployment of photographic details to form an argument was building on Wölfflin, but with most of Sandro Botticelli dedicated to reproductions, he alters the usual relationship of text and images so that one did not so much read the book as see it. Yashiro had seen Berenson's collection of details at Villa Itati, as well as Sir Robert Witt's vast holdings of photographs of art in London. Sandro Botticelli, published in a luxurious edition by the Medici Society, was probably the first work of art history to foreground details, and not just slightly cropped images, as central to the book's argument. This is emphasized by the fact that the text itself makes no direct reference to any given plate, so that text and images exist in parallel, rather than the former relying on the latter as a source of visual evidence. Yashiro is deeply concerned with Botticelli's treatment of the body in various motifs, such as flowers and birds, not, as he stresses, as a way of establishing Botticelli's identity as an artist, but to excavate their metaphorical meaning. The pointing hand in a Botticelli for Yashiro is really, quote, the symbol of an awakening of human intelligence, as was fittingly indicated by a psychologist, and as a consequence indicating the broader humanistic project of the Renaissance. In his commitment to the fragment's ability to provoke a powerfully effective response in a viewer, especially hair, drapery, and hands, there is a clear echo of Warburg's notion of pathos formulae, enduring figurative forms whose content is emotion. These details were commissioned by Yashiro from Brogi, the Florentine photographic studio, who waived their fee for the 200 photographs in order to keep the rights to them, and subsequently profited by selling the details as postcards, showing how intertwined scholarship, imagery, and commercialism were from the very beginning. Clark's encounter with Yashiro and then Warburg himself 2 years later set the stage for being able to move beyond connoisseurship and towards a more modern, even commercial vision, determined by the effective and intellectual value of a detail from a work of art. Montage is the collision between two independent shots to create an idea in the mind of the spectator. For Sergei Eisenstein, the tension between these images cut together creates a dialectic, so that thought can be conveyed to audiences in the cinema without recourse to language. Close-ups play a particular role, acting as a synecdoche for a larger concept. The part reflecting the whole, which is condensed within it and refracted in it, either narratively or intellectually. Yet the principle of pars pro toto does not underpin 100 details. The whole paintings themselves are never seen. Each detail is made meaningful in and of itself, not by how it captures the wider ideas of the work. This was part of Eisenstein's critique of 100 details. It denied access to, quote, the originality of the great works of the 15th and 16th centuries, instead removing the details from history and placing them in the immediate moment. As sight for Eisenstein is always, quote, a function of thought and consequently a social function, that of a way of being in the world, sight is an ideological endeavor. Consequently, Eisenstein considers 100 details as a metonym for how one could look in interwar England. Clark in this book was a picture editor, a cutter unfolding in cinematic sequences of old masters. One spread shows a beautiful woman looking out at the viewer, hair tasseled and her shoulders bare. Across the gutter stares a young man with a rich, elaborate collar. The conjunction creates a powerful sense of desire, further unconsummated. The woman is Venus from Correggio's Venus with Mercury and Cupid, and the young man is Alexander the Great, taken from Paolo Veronese's The Family of Darius before Alexander. Instead of looking at a kneeling Sisygambis, the mother of the conquered King Darius III of Persia, Alexander stares at Venus. The image, through montage, is transformed. The cinematic quality of 100 details means it unfolds as a series of cuts which are directed by Clark. It means it aligns with film, the medium of modernity par excellence, popular, demotic, monochromatic. Steve Jacobs has argued that the close-up in film intensifies and magnifies emotions and feelings, often highlighting the face of the protagonist and antagonist within the narrative. Clark uses the looming heads which punctuate the book to create a series of reactions, where the reader is meant to oscillate between desire and curiosity, from sanctity to awe. 26 of the spreads focus on heads. These giant heads by Gainsborough, Van Dyck, Renoir, Velasquez, and others are turned into dramatic tableaux of feeling removed from their historical and cultural moments in order that they, quote, glow like live coals in the present. Clark was building on art history's disciplinary origins within the history of photography and taking it to the next logical step, as cinematic art history. There was a photo montage adapted from the magazines of the day, particularly those edited by Stéphane Laurent, such as Weekly Illustrated, Lilliput, and Picture Post, the standard bearers of Britain's mainstream commercial modernism. This adoption of the techniques of magazines and motion pictures in book form emphasized moments of stillness and action. This is seen in the huge details of two pairs of hands, one holding their hands across the body, with rich lace and fingers restlessly moving, and the other doubtfully holding gloves against dense black clothes, only a signet ring to signify status. The first image is taken from Peter Paul Rubens' portrait of Helena Forment, and the second is from Hans Holbein's portrait of Christina of Denmark, Duchess of Milan. For Clark in his running commentary, these hands express the Renaissance and Baroque principles of composition. Yet because Clark's notes are placed first at the front of the book and not besides the images themselves, it does not function as a voiceover. Instead, the gap allows for the viewer's own response to take priority. Here, the sequence of hands reveals different emotions through the subject's body language, their fingering of their clothes portraying anxiety or determination, as in montage. Walter Benjamin had asked rhetorically in 1931, will not the caption become the most important component of the shot? 100 Details refuses the caption's primacy as determinant of meaning. This was at the heart of the book's popularity. It presented art with a contemporary immediacy that chimed with the techniques of cinema and media. Its genealogy involved drawing on a series of art historians from Yashiro and Berenson to Wölfflin and Warburg, which combined to show the photographic details of old master paintings could have a transformative impact on viewers, establishing a kind of vision defined by the fractured, the emotive, the witty, penetrating and ineluctably belonging to the mentality of the moment. The success of 100 Details led, perhaps inevitably, to a sequel. If the first volume was issued in the uneasy winter of 1938, then by the time more details from Pictures and National Gallery appeared in the war-torn years of 1941, the resonance had shifted. The National Gallery's collection had been sent to Manod Quarry in North Wales to protect it from aerial bombardment. And the gallery now hosted modern art commissioned by the War Artists Advisory Committee, headed by Clark himself. Clark had been planning the second book since the summer of 1939, but the war, with its disruptions to the gallery and paper shortages, delayed its appearance. It features even more dramatic cropping of images, for, as Clark explained, a charge reasonably brought against the previous volume was that some of the plates were not details at all, but were sometimes as much as half of a picture. We have tried to remedy this, and the present book contains a greater number of details in the more narrow sense. It was more austere too, with no commentary to each image pairing, just a 4-page introduction and a list of 100 plates. The reader is left with snatched excerpts from works, parts of townscapes, hands and feet, or baskets of fruit from a painting's corner. One spread shows a loosely painted group of soldiers composed of white sinewy brushstrokes opposite a hazy, expressive landscape where the trees are reduced to gestural marks and a chapel emerges out of the otherwise illegible landscape. These two paintings are an El Greco studio work, The Agony in the Garden of Gethsemane, and Thomas Lawrence's portrait of Queen Charlotte. The religious dimensions of the El Greco and Lawrence's representation of a monarch are entirely dispensed with, to focus on the different formal approaches to the application of paint and how brushstrokes can conjure a landscape with a few remarkable gestures. The careful architecture of Eton College Chapel stands in contrast to Lawrence's free handling of the trees and the torrid sky. time perceived that, quote, half the value of these picked fragments lies in their being divorced from their context, so that the viewer considers Lance's oscillation between specificity and motion in his application of oil paint. Clark controls what the reader sees, so that a royal portrait is transformed into a treatise on surface, illusion, and flatness. This ahistorical treatment of art, not so much anachronistic as standing outside of questions of historical change altogether, means that the works live on in the present, all the more crucial in 1941, when the artworks themselves were absent and could be conjured up only in memory or in snapshots. The transmuting of old master painting, making them current again like a surge of electricity, is more powerful than Clark's interest in the stylistic change between Van Eyck and Titian. Its appearance in 1941, too, testifies to the revival of canonical art and literature which took place in Britain during the war. The book, in its act of reproduction and editing, becomes like a sinister projection of a dream in some dark prophetic pool, according to Clark, twisting and distorting the artworks into new images, carrying their own independent charge. Clark stood down as director of the National Gallery in 1945, but in the last years of his directorship and under the new regime of Philip Hendy, smaller, more quotidian books of details appeared. Overseen by the then assistant keeper of the collection, Martin Davies, these hardback volumes of varying sizes due to paper rationing included birds and animals from the National Gallery, children from the National Gallery, a few saints from pictures in the National Gallery, and hands from pictures in the National Gallery. As each book is focused on a particular theme, they are less capricious than Clark's details, and in the case of birds and animals and children, clearly meant as bonbons for visitors, the next step in the commercial exploitation of the collection. Yet the most extraordinary of these books was paintings and drawings on the back of National Gallery's pictures. A scholarly work by Davis on the images on the backs of paintings, the fruit of studying the collection where it was sequestered in Wales for the war. Yet this explanation belays the sheer oddity of the book. It is composed of a succession of panels and stretchers, the paintings and drawings often crude or barely visible, alongside decorative patterns and cracked and damaged paneling. It represents the ultimate example of what Clark had started. The reader now no longer sees the paintings at all, only their reverse, that which the audience was never meant to see at all. Davis's preservationist impulse meant that the coherent image is wholly dispensed with in favor of broken fragments. Perhaps in 1946, when it was published, ruins were all that could be made sense of. Clark's 100 details, though, continued to have a life that far outstripped these companion volumes. In 1996, under Neil McGregor's directorship, a new, smaller format edition was issued, this time in colour, with Clark's commentary printed alongside the images. The cropping differs slightly in most cases, and the back of the book are black and white thumbnail images of each painting. This was followed by another edition in 2008, initiated by Nicholas Penny, with full-page details alternating with Clark's commentary alongside small reproductions of the original works, boxes outlining the areas which had been cropped. Each edition tweaks the layout and uses different technology. The 1990 edition used colour film, while the 2008 edition was created with digital photography. By showing the full original paintings and contextualizing them in colour, instead of leaving the details to remain distinct in monochrome, the new editions return the paintings to history, envoys from precisely contextualized pasts. Modernist site has been superseded in favour of a historicist and iconographic graze, the proper métier of a grand public art gallery that is custodian of the nation's heritage. In the 1930s, though, Clark's commercial modernism best seen at work in 100 Details, established a populist approach to Old Masters, which utilized technology and the changing nature of vision itself to make the collection resonate with a new audience. The true successor, in a way, to 100 Details was in fact André Malraux's La Psychologie de l'Art, translated into English as The Voices of Silence, published in France between 1947 and 1949. An existential novelist, member of the French Resistance, and Charles de Gaulle's Minister of Information in post-war France, Malraux was a public intellectual whose work crossed disciplinary boundaries. In the Psychologie de l'Art, Malraux realized that in the modern age of images, we, quote, have far more great works available to refresh our memories than those which even the greatest of museums could bring together. For a museum about walls is coming into being, and it will carry infinitely farther that revelation of the world of art, limited perforce, which the real museum offers within their walls. To prove his point that images of art could act as a catalyst, the book was lavishly illustrated on nearly every page with black and white and colour photographs of paintings and sculptures, often only showing their detail. He grasped that technology had rendered open a field of infinite possibilities bequeathed to us by the past, which would radically alter art objects themselves and how viewers in the 20th century perceived them. A cluster of restlessly shifting images was opening up to be manipulated by curators of vision. 100 Details anticipated, in ways that Clark could not have predicted, how the art of the Renaissance or Baroque period would become beautiful in irreconcilable fragments of the past, which can illuminate new and shifting revelations for audiences across the globe. Thank you. Any questions?